This question is about doing a bunch of smaller chunks of immersion time in the day versus sitting down and doing a longer period. So let me read the full question. So this is about doing like the Pomodoro sort of style, because this person's a college student and only has 2 to 3 hours per day for immersion. And they saw a video about doing sort of a split between study and then something else, like sort of going back and forth between the two. And they're wondering if they're losing efficiency in the immersion process by doing only, like, let's say 20 minutes of immersion time, then 40 minutes of study in their native language, and then sort of going back and forth. Is there sort of any suggestions for this kind of thing where there's various things that take a lot of time or effort to do, but they also want to be able to fit in efficient language acquisition, which is their more fun goal?
So I think there's two different questions. There's a short burst of language learning followed by something else that is not language learning related, versus short burst of language learning with breaks in between, and then going back into language learning. So the first one, where you're going from language learning to some other study or some other skill, that is an enormous context switch. And one of the biggest issues that a lot of folks face when in other parts of their lives, especially software developers, is context switching is really difficult. Your brain is completely focused on something, and then pulling it out of that problem and putting it somewhere else is an enormous challenge. Mm-hmm. That being said, some people are very good at context switching. Ben is very good at context switching.
I didn't really know it was an issue for people until like a couple months ago. It's like, oh, that's hard for people.
Yeah, I'm terrible at context switching. Like, it will take me a full 5 to 10 minutes to like get back up to speed on whatever I was doing before I did the context switch. So I think the first thing you have to ask is, am I actually capable of this? And is it good and healthy for me? The vast majority of people, the answer is no. The vast majority of people cannot context switch that quickly. It can take between, anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes to get back into the context, or to get into a new context. And what you're really looking for is a deeper flow state where you get over the initial barrier to get your mind completely focused and centered on that topic, on that challenge that you're working on. And then once you get into that flow state, you have much better results in the learning process or in whatever project you're working on. And so you want to get into that flow state. You want into that deep work state. These are two different books, Flow and Deep Work, that talk about how to do this more effectively. And so constantly switching between different topics and different contexts makes it really hard to do that, and makes your study and immersion time way less effective.
Oh, we're losing you. Hang on. Internet. Buffer.
All right, how about now?
I think you're back.
Okay. Should I repeat what I said?
Yeah, just the last 5 seconds.
Okay, so if you can't get into that flow state because you're constantly switching contexts, then your study time, your immersion time is going to be way worse. It's going to produce worse results for the majority of people. Occasionally, there are some people out there who can do the context switch, no problem.
Before you hop into the second version, is there like a way that you could sort of test to see if you're going to have these, like it is going to impact your effectiveness? Can you like do a trial and say, like, if it feels like this, then you probably are losing the efficiency, but if it doesn't, then actually maybe you're in that group that can excel with this kind of context switching?
I never thought about it. For me, it's so obvious. Like, I can feel it happening in the moment. It feels like
what does it feel like then?
Working in slow motion. Like, it feels like, for example, I was working on the finances for the business on Sunday, and Ben sent me a message, and it was referring to a conversation we had 3 days before, and I had zero recollection of that conversation. And so he sent me the message, and I was like, I have no idea what that means. And it took me a full 60 seconds to remember it. And then it took me another 5 minutes to remember what, like, all of the details about that conversation. So to me, that is like obviously like the feeling of context switching feels like pulling myself out of a hole and like in the
Into
process
bright
of
sunlight. Like,
into bright sunlight, you're just like dazed. My brain is just like it's working in slow motion. It feels like my thoughts are sludge or like molasses that are dripping out rather than flowing. So to me, it's just like an obvious feeling. I actually don't know how it would feel for someone that's like in the middle, where it would sort of be okay or maybe not. But generally, if you think about like when is your most effective and efficient time, when you're sitting there like, yes, I am like jamming, I am, working great, I'm very focused, I'm making progress. And then think about how long it actually takes you to get to that point. Because if it's like, oh, I can switch to that mode in 2 minutes or 5 minutes, then you're probably fine to do context switching. But if it takes you 10 to 20 minutes to get there, then you're probably not good at context switching.
Especially if 10 to 20 minutes is a lot of time for immersion. Like you get to your peak and then you stop, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, you definitely don't want to like get into the flow state and immediately interrupt yourself. That's like the worst thing you can do.
What about the other sort of possibility where it's something plus breaks? What does that look like, and how is that effective or ineffective?
Yeah, so I sort of think of the like the Pomodoro method where you have 25 minutes on and 5 minutes off. The idea there is two different things. One, taking a step back helps you determine whether you're doing the right thing. So you have your 25 minutes heads down. You don't actually, you might go down the wrong pathway. And the 5 minutes is meant to interrupt your workflow on purpose in order to help you have a better understanding of what you're doing. So that's part of it. The second thing is the Pomodoro method is meant for people who are really struggling to get into that flow state because it's too big of a task or they aren't sure exactly how to do it. And so having a 25-minute timer help overcome the barrier, like the motivational barrier, the activation energy barrier, because they can be like, you know what, 3 hours sounds too hard, but I can do 20 minutes. And then 20 minutes comes up and you're like, okay, actually I can do a lot more than this. So it's more about helping to overcome the initial activation energy to get into that flow state. And it's also particularly useful when you're doing something that is really mentally intensive, where your brain starts to hurt. And for a lot of people in the immersion space and the language learning space, they get a feeling of brain melt where their brain literally starts to hurt. And so giving yourself consistent breaks in order to allow your brain to rest for a minute before jumping back in can be very effective in helping you to maintain a solid amount of energy for a longer period of time. And those 5-minute breaks are not meant to be like, oh, during this 5-minute break, I'm going to go on social media, or I'm going to like do a different thing or like a different task, or work on like a different piece of homework or project. Those 5-minute breaks are really just meant to allow you to rest your brain, not to switch into a different context, just to like rest for a second. So as long as you are not trying to switch into a different context for those 5 minutes, it should be pretty easy to get back into your flow state in the next Pomodoro session.
Cool. Do you personally prefer a specific style of like timing your immersion, or do you sort of just see what happens?
I use the timer when I'm struggling to convince myself to do something. So if there's something I don't want to do, I'm like, oh, I have to do it, and like I don't really feel like doing it, the timer really helps me start that process. So I can set a 20-minute timer and be like, you know what, I don't feel like doing this for 3 hours. I'm going to do 20 minutes and see what happens. And usually by the end of that 20 minutes, you get into like, okay, I'm starting to get some momentum in here. I can keep going with that. And then at a certain point, I will just get so deep into that project that I forget the timer's there. And at that point, it doesn't really matter.
It goes off and it startles you.
Right. I mean, at that point, the purpose of the timer is actually to pull me out of that mode, because sometimes you get on autopilot and you go down the wrong path and you just like can't stop going down that path unless something interrupts you. This is more in like the coding world. I'm thinking back to my software engineering days. With immersion, it's similar in the sense of like setting the timer helps to overcome the initial activation energy. Like I just want to get into it, especially if you're doing something boring like test prep, which is what I'm working on right now. But as soon as you get deep into it, there's no real reason to interrupt yourself unless you are concerned about going too far down some rabbit hole that is not going to be useful or effective. With immersion, you want to go down those rabbit holes. You want to get super excited and like obsessed with something. So I wouldn't recommend breaking your flow.
Sure.
So it depends on where you are in the process, your personality. There's a lot of different factors that you have to play with to figure out what works for you.